If you own a 1x30-inch grinder, sander, such as a Harbor Freight or a Grizzly, you can vastly improve the accuracy of your grinds by installing a glass platen on your grinders such as this. It's a ceramic glass platen. You can do it very easily. I'm going to show you how. Also, at the end of this video, I'm going to show you some shop tips that I found very helpful, perhaps some of which you didn't realize. A lot of you guys out there started out with a 1x30-inch grinder, and you've graduated perhaps onto another grinder, or maybe even still the 1x30 is the only one that you have. What I'm going to show you today is I'm going to put a glass platen on my 1x30-inch grinder. This happens to be a Grizzly model, but Harbor Freight makes one as well. So I'm going to show you how to do this and how to do it safely. Take our belt off. Take our table off. And here's our little metal platen, which leaves a lot to be desired. Does the job, but only partially. And it's held on let me see. I believe this is actually is a 3mm. So, this is what you have. It's going to need cleaning up. I've used this for a long time. It's a bit rough, but if I put a glass platen on there, it'll make that far more usable. So, let's go on to the next step. This is a 1/4-20 drill and tap. You can buy these most of the hardware store. DeWalt makes them. Comes with a drill bit as well as the tap. So even if you don't have a full tap and die set, you can just pick one of these up. They're not terribly expensive. I forgot the cost now, but you've got a drill and tap that'll work just fine. Of course, you have to have a 1/4-20 bolt, which I just happen to have. But when you're at the hardware store, just make sure you get a couple of 1/4-20 bolts to use. One thing I should mention, 1/4-20 is not a 1/4-inch drill, so don't make that mistake. What it is, you'll notice on the package, it's a number 7 drill bit, so you're going to want to use this. Now this bolt though happens to be a 1/4-20 bolt, and this actually is the size that would go through. This is a little bit long, but again, I don't worry about it because I'll just grind it off when it's done. But the drill bit itself is a number 7 that comes with the little kit. I want to drill holes in this. Now you notice my piece of steel is a little bit too long. This is 5/32. It just happened to have a piece I kicking around here. Excuse me. The thickness doesn't matter as much as long as your glass platen will fit on top of this. That's the important thing. That's what needs to be accomplished. For instance, here's my glass platen, and that needs to sit on there, and if you can see, that's going to sit just very nicely. The glass platen hangs out just a touch over this. As far as the length is concerned, here I'm not worried about it. Now the width here is just about a 1/2 inch, just a touch over 1/2 inch. There, it's not critical. You just want to make sure it clears on your table, your little work rest on your 1x30 grinder. But we're going to be putting this bolt in actually from the back. So I just used a little bit of Gorilla Glue to just to hold it in place temporarily. Obviously this Gorilla Glue isn't going to hold it. This, you just use a little bit of spray Gorilla Glue to get her to hold on there so I could work with it. Now on the back I want to mark a couple of places where I'm going to put the hole. I'm going to put two bolts in it. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it there. And then hopefully you can see my setup. The face of the platen is facing down. Here's my little piece of metal I'm going to put as a shelf at the bottom. Got my hole ready. Got my number 7 bit. Put a little bit of oil on there. And you notice I'm using a block of wood. For my experience, I'm not the expert here, but so often I've used my drill vise, and metal will slip out of that. When I use just a piece of scrap 2x4, I've never had it slip. So everything is tight. I've got it down solid. Everything is tight. So I'm going to start drilling my first hole. And I am through. See, my hole is drilled through. That glue is actually holding it in place right now. So I'm going to clean this up and I'm going to get ready to do the drill and tap. Now you'll notice I'm using a very small, this is just a 1-inch clamp to clamp that in place. So I'm tightening that up before I put it in the vise. That's one of the nice little things about keeping this long temporarily, because I've got this first hole to put a this gives me something to hold on to. Sure that's tight. Sure my holes are lined up. Okay. A little bit of cutting oil. Now I've got a handle for my tap, but you can use a pair of vice grips. Metal isn't really hard, so it should go through fairly easy. Back it off. I am through. Okay. First hole is all tapped. Let's see how well it did. Now it's time to put our platen together. We've got our holes drilled and tapped. Now you'll notice that previously it appears as if I was using a regular bolt. What I needed to do was go to cap screws. Now these are quarter 20 cap screws, excuse me, 1/2 inch long. And the reason is your tolerances on the back are very tight. So in order to have that fit in there, it's a lot easier to use a hex key to put them in. So that's what I'm doing. Now you notice the difference in my 2x72. I've got just regular bolts that I've used. Now this particular piece of metal is, on my 2x72, is 3/4 of an inch wide, and I had lots of room, drilled the holes, tapped them, and then sanded this off. And then my platen, which is 2 by 8 inches, fits on there perfectly on this particular one. So your little metal plate that you're using here, you want to do according to your particular grinder, in order to have it correct. And you notice that this hangs over just a little bit, which is good because your belt actually goes this way down across. Remember, it comes down from the top down. And it's the same way with our little 1 by 30 inch grinder. Does the same thing. The belt comes down this direction. So this little plate, you want to have your glass platen hang over that just a tight little bit, and you'll see as we put it together that's exactly what the case is. So I've got it ready. I'm about ready to put my little steel plate on. And I'm going to use just a touch of Loctite on my threads, help keep it in place. Okay, get our cap screws in tight. And you'll see the clearance in the back is much nicer. A regular bolt, the clearances could be really tight if not impossible. Now you'll see they're sticking out about a 1/2 inch, but we're going to take care of that on the belt grinder. Okay, got this all cut off, ground off. You can either cut them off with a hacksaw and then file it off, or you can use your grinder. You can use your grinder a little bit even without the platen, your 1 by 30, so you can, either way, you can do that. So now we've got it all set and ready for the glass platen itself. Now, last thing I want to do is get some alcohol and clean it all up. Make sure there's no residual oil and stuff on it because we want it to hold well. So both my metal part of the platen as well as the glass platen itself. Now in this case, this piece here is about a 1/2 inch in depth. So if you have about a 1/2 inch to work with, so that you can put it from either side, and of course it's 1 inch wide. And again, you need to have your glass just barely hang over the edge of your piece of metal. So your metal is just acting as a shelf, as a safety measure to hold your glass. If this is the case and you got a Grizzly or a Harbor Freight, then a piece of glass 1 inch by 2.5 inches is just about perfect for that. So what I'm using is double-sided carpet tape, and this particular brand had good reviews on Amazon. That's why I picked it, and I found that it just works excellent. Now usually I would put the tape on the glass itself, but actually it's a little easier to work with putting the tape on the metal part of the platen in this case, because I've got a little handle to hold on to while I do it. Put my first piece on, and Little pair of Fisker scissors work very nicely. Peel off the backing to expose the tape. And I'm going to put a second piece on just to make sure that it's going to hold well. Actually, I'm going to start with a fresh, because that I was cutting that wasn't quite an inch wide. And this stuff sticks good. So I'm going to put a second extra strength for my then your scissors clean up with a little bit of alcohol afterwards. That off. Okay. So there is my 2 pieces of double-sided carpet tape on my metal part of my platen. I'm going to peel this off and ready to put the glass on. Now, if you take a look at this piece of glass, this particular piece of glass is not flawless. It's got a couple little nicks and stuff on the edges. I'm not worried about that. As long as there's no cracks or big chunks out of it, this is going to do just fine. It's not going to affect the functionality or the durability of this particular piece of glass. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick this on. Very carefully press it on there. Now, hopefully you can see this. As you press down, you can tell that it's sticking to the glass, because you can see through the glass. Keep pressing it until it's firmly adhered to the tape. Okay. Be careful. Now these edges I touched a little bit with the sandpaper so that they're not razor sharp. You don't want razor sharp edges anyways, because remember, your belt, the back of the belt is gliding over this platen. Doesn't have to be razor sharp. Razor sharp would actually be a detriment to it. Okay, now this platen is ready to put on. You see I've got the little metal, the glass comes over the edge just slightly. The belt's going to warm just fine around there and down, and you're going to have a nice flat platen to work with. So let's go over and put it back together on the grinder and we'll see how it works. Okay, let's put our grinder back together again. Of course, you want to have your belt square, so if you've got a square, it's really beneficial. You want your belt square to the platen. Excuse me, not your belt, but your table square to your platen. Tighten it up. Okay. Nice and square. Now let's see how she runs. Plug it in. Do my adjustment. Works beautifully. One of the complaints a lot of guys have with the 1x30 is because of the old Platen. It's very difficult to get consistent grinds on both sides of your knives or whatever you're working with. But with a glass Platen, nice and square, it gives you a big advantage ahead of time. So you can do it just as easy as I've shown you here. I have here some of the things that I used during this project I wanted to point out to you. Right here is a piece of granite. You know, there's you can spend a lot of money on some very expensive stuff. I just went to a place that sells granite countertops, and this piece here measures out 11 inches by 18 inches. And it's almost, it's about 1.5 inches thick. I paid $15 for it. So yes, you can go and spend a lot more money, but this has worked for me just fine. So just one little tip that'll save you quite a bit of money. Now, as far as the shelf is concerned on our little Platen, I just used a piece of stock that I had on hand. This is 5/32 thick. It's 1095 steel, but you can use most anything that you can drill, because all you're doing is you're just making a little shelf there to put your glass Platen on. So you're just cutting it to size. The other thing you want to remember is when you're tapping this, make sure your holes are lined up. You probably want to measure a little bit more carefully than I did. It worked just fine, but if you use cap screws, it's a lot easier to fit in the back of your Platen to fasten it. So when you drill your holes, and then when you tap them, you want to make sure that your holes are lined up, and really everything goes together quite nicely. Now, I used a 1/4-20 tap that comes with a number 7 bit, as I mentioned earlier. Now, if you're using a different size bolt or cap screw, then you get one accordingly. But this particular cap screw that I just got at Home Depot, is a 1/4-20 tap screw. It was 1/2 inch long, and as I showed you earlier, it was a little bit long, but then just ground it off afterwards. I also used a little bit of Loctite. Don't know if I need it, but better safe than sorry. Pair of Fisker scissors. When you're cutting tape, pair of Fisker scissors, these are nice and sharp, or an X-Acto knife. Really works nice. I use this stuff just constantly. You'll use it more than you possibly imagine if you have it on hand to use. Also, this is just a simple punch that I got at Harbor Freight, but it does the job. Makes marks in my Kydex, makes marks on the metal, does absolutely fine. A couple other things I find indispensable in the shop is spray-on Gorilla Glue. Use it for a lot of different things. You noticed I had a little problem with fastening my metal together when I was putting my Platen together. It was just for a temporary fix. Actually, what I didn't do right is I didn't let that set long enough. After the glue set a little bit, it kept it in place, then it was easier to mark the metal so that I get my holes drilled. The other thing that's important is alcohol. Just pick this up at Walmart or any place. I use it quite frequently. Keep your stuff clean, especially when you're going to be gluing or putting stuff together. Remember I mentioned that I prefer a piece of wood? Interesting how many times just a scrap piece of 2x4 works so very nicely on the drill press. Yes, I do use a regular drill press vise, but quite often with working with small pieces of metal that want to kind of come out of this, unless it's in good and square, I use a piece of wood and use the vise grips that go on the drill press. The wood holds it, it fastens it much easier, and it is much, much safer. Also, I mentioned squares. Now I have this little machinist square. I just love this thing. I use it constantly. Make sure my platens on my grinders are squared up to snuff. But if you've got a speed square or another square, there's different kinds that are available. If you've got this on hand, you'll find them very useful to keep things where they need to be. If your platen is set up so it's nice and square to begin with, and it rides on your belt the way it should, as I mentioned before, some little nicks on the corner here, it's no big deal. It doesn't mean anything. You just want a platen that's good and solid, no cracks or anything in it. This one here, I can actually take this off, reuse the other side very easily. This will come off with a little bit of acetone, peel right off, change the tape, turn it over, or install a new one. So you get a lot more mileage out of your platen. And I've used this one actually quite a while now. And on my 2x72 inch grinder, I've used it a long time. I have yet to replace it. There's no need to. It just lasts and lasts and lasts. So unless you find yourself, you've hit it and got a big chunk out of it or something, it'll work just fine. And rides over, the belt rides over there so much nicer, so much smoother, and you're able to accurately move your belt from side to side and get the grind that you want. Last but certainly not least is the glass itself. This measures 1 inch by 2.5 inches, and it is a high temperature glass made to withstand the heat. Please don't use regular glass. It could be very dangerous. This can take temperatures well over 1300 degrees. This particular size though fits the Grizzly and Harbor Freight quite nicely. I do suggest though that before you install the glass, get your little piece of metal for your shelf and then install the metal with the measurement of the glass there so that you can get them even. But this falls just below your table height and works very nicely. Now you can get this glass, there's a link in the description below, and other sizes are available as well. So you can install it, you'll enjoy it, you'll appreciate how much more efficiently your little 1 by 30 inch grinder will work.